Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Before we get into today's video, if you're enjoying my channel and the videos that I make and you'd like to help keep these videos going, you can do so on Patreon. On Patreon, you can send $1 or $2 my way, and that goes directly toward helping keep these videos going. If that's something that you would be interested in doing, you will have access to extra things as well. Those things include knowing about what I'm working on next first, PDFs and other book recommendations based on the sources that I'm using to make these videos, as well as fun things like postcards from me to you. So if you'd like to know more about that and become a patron yourself, you can do so at patreon.com/Sashinka. Now let's get on with the video. If you've ever heard Brazilians speaking Portuguese, you've probably heard the construction Deixa EU, and that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Constructions like Deixa eu te falar uma coisa or Deixa eu fazer are extremely common in colloquial Brazilian speech. This type of construction is so common in Brazil that it is used by speakers of all different educational levels as well as social classes. However, if you speak European Portuguese or other Romance languages, this construction might seem just a little bit strange to you. There are a number of reasons why this construction is so unusual. One of them is that it is mostly limited to this verb, deixar. We don't habitually see this construction being used with other verbs, but we do see it quite frequently and quite naturally with the verb deixar in colloquial Brazilian speech. But also, and perhaps more importantly, is that the natural way of saying the same thing in European Portuguese as well as other Romance languages uses a different construction altogether. In European Portuguese, and indeed in similar constructions in other Romance languages, that construction would be deixa-me. The construction deixa-me uses the direct object pronoun instead of the subject pronoun. So with that in mind, I set out to understand why exactly this construction exists in the way that it does in Brazilian speech. In doing so, I came upon 4 main factors that contribute to this construction being so natural in Brazilian Portuguese. We'll talk a bit about all 4 of these factors and how they relate to each other in this video. The first one that I want to talk about is the analogy to the construction of the type para eu fazer. Superficially, these 2 constructions look quite similar. You have a word, you have a pronoun, and you have a verb in the infinitive. But actually, these 2 constructions are not especially similar. Para, as we know, is a preposition. And when we have constructions of the type para eu fazer with the subject pronoun, we're inserting the subject pronoun in order to avoid the ambiguity that would arise from not having a marked person at the end of a conjugated infinitive. This is why we say para fazermos instead of para nós fazermos, unless we want to add emphasis onto nós. In that case, we would also say the subject pronoun. If we say para fazer, we create an ambiguity of person. That person could be eu, o senhor, ela, and so on. If we look at the construction deixa eu fazer, on the other hand, deixa eu fazer cannot work in the same way because deixa comes from the verb deixar. Since it is a verb, it requires an object, and that object is the pronoun that we're inserting into the phrase. Now we know that eu is a subject pronoun, so it doesn't make a lot of grammatical sense to say deixa eu fazer. Instead, we would have deixa-me fazer because me is the object of deixa. This is the reasoning of the normative standard as well as most Romance languages. But this explanation alone is not sufficient to describe why we have deixa eu in the first place in Brazilian Portuguese. So for the second factor, I looked at the reduction of object pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese and the effect that that's had on Brazilian speech. This is a topic that I covered a little bit in my series on the evolution of Portuguese as a language in the video about Brazilian Portuguese. If you haven't seen that, I recommend you go do so. This type of construction using the first person subject pronoun instead of the object pronoun is more typical of children's speech. Things like olha eu or even dá eu. These are things that we would naturally expect to hear from children who are just learning the basic faculties of language. This is a normal process in the adaptation to grammatical functions in a language. So this is something that is normal and natural in the way that children speak as they're learning to speak the language, but we wouldn't necessarily expect to hear it from adults speaking. And generally speaking, we don't hear this among adult speakers in Brazilian Portuguese. The grammatical reduction of pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese is mostly relegated to the third person object pronouns. That being said, the construction of the type Deixa EU, which does use the subject pronoun for the first person, can be seen as analogous to the use of the third person subject pronouns instead of the object pronoun. In practical terms, I'm talking about constructions like vi ela instead of via, where the subject pronoun has substituted the object pronoun. In the case of deixar, we have a systematized use of the subject pronoun in the position where we would expect an object pronoun. This leads us into factor number 3. And factor number 3 is talking about syntactical rationalization of certain characteristics of Brazilian speech. To put that in simpler terms, we're talking about the way that Brazilian Portuguese puts the pronoun before verbs as its default position. What I'm talking about here is the grammaticalization of proclisis, or proclis in Portuguese, which is also anchored on the second verb in verbal constructions using more than one verb in Brazilian Portuguese. It is for this reason why we can have deixa eu te falar in Brazilian Portuguese, but saying something like deixa-me te falar would be unnatural. Under this grammatical logic, the reasoning is fairly simple. If we were to use two object pronouns and anchor them in front of the second verb, it would create its own type of ambiguity. Therefore, using the subject pronoun gives us more syntactic information about what is happening with the verb fazer. The grammatical analysis therefore shifts eu te falar as being one single verbal object. But this is why we couldn't have deixa-me te falar. In other words, we have information pertaining to falar. Who is doing the talking is indicated by the subject pronoun, and who is being talked to is indicated by the object pronoun. This type of syntactic structure is a very wide divergence from the traditional Portuguese syntax, and in fact represents a very unique evolution in colloquial Brazilian grammar. When it comes to pronouns, their placement, and their usage, Brazilian Portuguese has innovated quite a lot. If you'd be interested in more videos on this topic about how Brazilian Portuguese has innovated with object pronouns and what implications that has had on colloquial Brazilian grammar, let me know in a comment. But there's one other factor that I'd like to talk about, and that is factor number 4, and that is the lexical differentiation between different meanings of the verb deixar. Deixar has a couple of different primary meanings, and I'll use colloquial Brazilian Portuguese to illustrate them. It can mean let, such as to permit or allow, such as in the Brazilian construction deixa eu. Deixa eu falar means let me say or let me speak. Permit me to do so. Allow me to do so. But it can also mean leave, as in leave be, lay off, or stop. In Brazilian Portuguese, we'd also have me deixa. That would mean leave me alone, let me be, and so on. Deixar can also mean leave in other general capacities, but these two meanings are the ones that I want to focus on. Generally speaking, in colloquial Brazilian Portuguese, me deixa refers to the second of these meanings, meaning to leave. Leave me alone, leave me be. Me deixa em paz, and so on. What we can see in colloquial Brazilian speech is that there is a lexical differentiation between these two meanings of the same verb. The selection and placement of the pronoun relative to the verb deixar is used as a device to indicate the meaning of the verb deixar intended when talking. So it can be said that there's a little bit of lexical differentiation as well going on here. We can see this in the relatively rare occurrences of structures like me deixa falar in favor of deixa eu falar. This also helps to understand why this construction is mostly limited to the verb deixar in and of itself. As we noted at the beginning, this is not a type of construction that is especially natural when used with other verbs. But because of the special characteristics of the verb deixar, we have this factor as well. When we put all of these factors together, we create the conditions under which deixa eu becomes permissible and normal in colloquial speech. But because this is em bom português, let's not forget that when we're talking or writing carefully, we should always use the direct object pronoun, or me, instead of the subject pronoun, eu. So we would have deixa-me fazer falar and so on. So that's all I've got for this video, and now you know, assim se fala em bom português. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. I make lots and lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.